Good morning everyone, it's Charlie Veitch here. I'm here in front of my computer and as you can see, it's James Bloodworth who wrote an article for The Independent of England saying, "Why does ISIS hate us so much?" And to save you guys, you illiterate low-watt morons, from having to read it, because your attention span doesn't go that far, I'll read it for you, because I like this article and I think, you know, if the media is culture creation, if it is propaganda, if it's training you how to think, this, by James Bloodworth, is how I think you should think about the Islamic State. Let's proceed. Alright. Why does ISIS hate us so much? It's a question that's baffling the left. But like the Nazis, it's impossible to try and explain the thinking behind their extremist beliefs. When it comes to the totalitarian rebellions against liberal societies throughout history, sophisticated people have very often failed to grasp what goes on in the minds of the fanatic. Back in the 1930s, attempts to explain fascism famously tripped up many leading intellectuals of the time. Hitler's demands to expand the Third Reich were taken by many otherwise sophisticated people as code for something else. Was it not true, after all, that the Treaty of Versailles had imposed punitive and unreasonable conditions on Germany? As Paul Berman noted in his book, Terror and Liberalism, despite the SS repeatedly reaffirming at its death camps that here there is no why, for much of the left there was always a why. As he writes, the anti-war socialist gazed across the Rhine and simply refused to believe that millions of upstanding Germans had enlisted in a political movement whose animating principles were paranoid conspiracy theories, blood-curdling hatreds, medieval superstitions, and the lure of murder. It wasn't just the French left that tied itself in mental knots over the rapid growth of militarist fascism. In an edition of the British pacifist newspaper Peace News, the Marquess of Tavistock, who sat on the National Council for the Peace Pledge Union, blamed German aggression not on the lunacy of National Socialism, but instead on the very serious provocation which many Jews had given by their avarice and arrogance when exploiting Germany's financial difficulties by their associations with commercialized vice and by their monopolization of certain professions. And here's a quick footnote by Charlie Veitch. There you go. Intelligent, otherwise intelligent, well-bred, well-educated people blaming Jewish people for monopolizing a business. Anti-Semitism. Anyway, let us proceed. In a letter written in 1942, the pacifist poet D.S. Savage also famously informed George Orwell that Hitler required not condemnation, but understanding. You know, if we hadn't upset the Germans so much, they wouldn't have had the Nazis. More recently, a good portion of many column inches dedicated to explaining the 2001 terror attacks in New York similarly relied upon a straightforward inability to countenance the existence of Al-Qaeda. Thoughtful people instinctively hunted for so-called root causes of jihadist violence in the material world, largely ignoring the seriousness of the ideas held by the perpetrators. The real spark of fascist violence must always and everywhere be poverty and hardship, or so it was assumed, hence the multiple attempts to conflate the repression of the Palestinians with 9/11, despite the fact that Al-Qaeda was and remains ideologically opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state. In reality, the sheer irrationality of violent Islam should have been obvious when in the years following 9/11, young fanatics started, sometimes successfully, trying to blow up nightclubs. The British-born Islamists who plotted in 2004 to murder clubbers in the Ministry of Sound nightclubs in London did not, after all, cite Palestine or imperialism as their casus belli, but instead gleefully talked about the murdering, those slags dancing around. In other words, it was our liberalism that would-be bombers despised, rather than our inability to be sufficiently liberal. Right, let me just say that again, because this is the most important sentence in Mr. Blood-soaked... Sorry, what's his name? Not Blood-soaked. Oh, that's a bit of a Freudian slip. Bloodworth. Let me find it again. Right. In other words, it was our liberalism that the would-be bombers hated rather than our inability to be sufficiently liberal. Indeed, as with almost all fanatical religious movements, an obsession with the way women behave goes right to the heart of Islamism. Sayyid Qutb, the author of the Mein Kampf of Islamism, Milestones, embraced a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam on the back of a visit to the United States, where he found himself appalled at the freedom afforded to American women. Yet all too often, rather than acknowledge the existence of pathological movements that reject the very premise of a free society, the default assumption amongst liberals has run something like this. Fascist violence must be code for something else, probably despair. The fanatic is only fanatical because we have driven him to it. If only Britain and America had behaved properly, they would not hate us. And of course, the West has certainly behaved in ways that have helped to swell the ranks of movements like the Islamic State. Just as they were hold on. And of course, the West has certainly behaved in ways that have helped to swell the ranks of movements like the Islamic State, just as there were atrocities committed by American armies during the previous centuries that provided ammunition of the communist state. But let us be clear, the root cause of fascism and what the Islamic State is practicing is clerical fascism, is an absolute rejection of a plural and democratic society. It is our existence, rather than the subtleties of how we behave, that is intolerable to the Islamic State, hence current attempts to exterminate un-Islamic religious minorities in Iraq, like the minority Christians or the Yazidis. A genocide in the making, thankfully being thwarted at the moment by the United States and the United Kingdom, who are bombing Islamic State fighters to prevent them going up the mountain outside Dohuk. Anyway, it's a difficult name, but very interesting news. Alright. Despite his many flaws, even the consummate Marxist Leon Trotsky recognized the psychopathic elements that underpins fascism, writing on the growth of Nazism in the 1930s that today, not only in the peasant homes but also in the skyscrapers, there lives alongside the 20th century, the 10th or 13th century. 100 million people use electricity and still believe in the magic power of signs and exorcism. In Iraq and Syria today, alongside the 21st century exists the 7th. To look for the root cause of ISIS is to miss the point. The croup represents all the subterranean barbarism that every so often is apt to crawl, blinking into the light, out from the depths of the human subconscious. Intelligent people enjoy saying that nothing exists in a vacuum. In reality, things very often do. Some outcomes are no more than the result of people having certain thoughts and as a consequence performing certain actions. ISIS would like to see us all drop dead in an instant. Unlike their European predecessors, there really is no why. Thank you, Mr. James Bloodworth. I couldn't agree more. And I just want to say at the end that with a rational agent, for example the USSR during the Cold War, NATO and primarily America and Britain could achieve peace through superior firepower, always knowing that the insane vodka-drunk Russians could launch a cruise missile here and there, but a rational agent will know that annihilation, because there might not be an afterlife, you might have to enjoy this life. A rational agent will not gamble on the possibility of an afterlife, but a maniac who has been since birth brainwashed to believe that in jihad you're guaranteed virgins, virgins to defile in paradise if you just give your life or blow yourself up or fight, for whatever barbaric kind of prehistoric Stone Age mentality you want to fight for. So I just want to thank The Independent and thank James Bloodworth. What a great name, James. James Bloodworth. I mean, this is a fantastic name. So thank you, and I agree.